like now to give the floor to Professor Rafał Pankowski, who will be our moderator today. And we kindly also ask you to be muted during the lecture and during the presentations. And of course, we would like to dedicate a lot of time to our discussions after the lecture, and we will have this chance. So welcome, everyone. And Rafał, the floor is yours.
Unmute. Rafał, unmute.
Thank you. I am unmuted now. Hello, Kosta.
Hi.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next meeting in the frame of the project of the Never Again Association, in partnership with our friends and partners in Southeast Asia, with the support of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. I am very honored to welcome you to this session. As always, we have a very diverse group. So I would, as usual, encourage everybody to write your name and country you come from in the chat. And I am really looking forward to our dialogue today. The subject is, I think, one of the most challenging topics that we are tackling in this series. The Holocaust and other genocides: is comparison possible? And we want to discuss the possibility of talking about the Holocaust, talking about other genocides in a way which is responsible, which is sensitive, which avoids trivialization and distortion, at the same time as building solidarity and building empathy across borders, across cultures. And our keynote speaker today, Konstanty Gebert, I know has a lot of valuable thoughts on the subject. We talked about this subject with Konstanty several times in the last months, for many hours. Konstanty is a well-known international reporter and columnist for Polish and international media, covering the Polish democratic transformation, but also the conflicts in Bosnia, in the Middle East, also the aftermath of genocide in Rwanda. Konstanty Gebert is also a co-founder of the so-called Jewish Flying University in Poland in the 70s, as well as the Polish Council of Christians and Jews, also founder of the Polish Jewish intellectual monthly Midrasz. He is the author of many books on topics such as Polish recent history, the wars in Yugoslavia, history of Israel, commentaries on the Torah, and also a fascinating panorama of the European 20th century. And his latest book, very strongly related to our topic today, a book on comparative genocide, is going to be published in Poland shortly. We also have a good friend as a commentator, Nicky Diamond, comes from Myanmar. He is currently a PhD candidate in political and legal anthropology at the University of Constance in Germany. Nicky is an advisor to Fortify Rights, which is an international human rights organization in the region of Southeast Asia. His research is mainly devoted to the problem of anti-Muslim hate speech in Myanmar. Nicky has a a long history as a human rights defender in Myanmar. For example, he founded Youth for Social Change in Myanmar in 2007. And I should also mention that we met with Nikki in Bangkok several years ago, and later he visited us in Poland, and our conversations over the years also constituted an important inspiration for the design of this intercultural project between Poland, between Europe and Southeast Asia. So without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Konstanty Gebert. I just want to mention, like Natalia said, we are going to reserve some time and space to questions and comments. So if you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat immediately, or you can make them after our speakers. Thank you, Konstanty. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody. It is slightly intimidating to be speaking to people on several continents at the same time. Actually, quite scary when you think of it. But I will try to do my best. Let me start with a personal anecdote. A couple of years back, in the university town of Butare in southern Rwanda, I met a person who had probably the only private museum of the Shoah in his apartment. He had participated in a study course at Yad Vashem Institute in Jerusalem, managed to convince Yad Vashem to give him a number of pictures and graphs that he could display, brought them back to Rwanda, hung them up on the walls of his apartment, and then would spend his time dragooning people from the street into the apartment to show them around and explain the history of the Shoah. Thierry, his name, had been a guerrilla fighter in the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which in '94, through strength of arms, stopped the genocide of the Tutsis at the hands of the extremist Hutu regime, lost almost all of his family in the struggle, and then, as I say, spent his time teaching about the Shoah to Rwandans who probably couldn't even place the sites of the Shoah on the map. And when I asked him, Thierry, why are you doing this? Why is that important? He told me, you know, it's so important for us to understand that it did not happen only to us. And I was immensely moved by his words, because one thing that victims of genocide usually share is the fundamental belief that our experience is unique, that nobody else can presume to understand what we've gone through. And frankly, this feeling is entirely legitimate. Each genocide is obviously unique, and at the same time constitutes a trauma of such dimensions that the very idea of comparing it to anything else seems almost obscene. At the same time, the basis of understanding is comparison. If we do not compare, we preclude the possibility of understanding. And both positions, the one stressing the uniqueness and the one stressing the necessity to compare, are legitimate. And trying to reconcile them is a task which not only methodologically, but morally, indeed metaphysically, seems impossible. On top of that, the Shoah, I will explain in a moment why I use the Hebrew term Shoah, rather than the more universally used Holocaust. The Shoah in the field of genocide does stand out. It was probably the most brutal, certainly the most industrial, and definitely the most uncompromising genocide. By uncompromising, I mean that as opposed to other genocides, there was no way out. In the Cambodian genocide, you could avoid being killed, or at least reduce your chances by becoming a Khmer Rouge. In the Armenian genocide, conversion to Islam, at least in the case of women, was a relatively safe strategy. In the Ukrainian Holodomor, becoming a communist usually meant your life would be spared. There were no survival strategies for Jews in the Shoah. There were Jewish collaborators who extended their lives by serving the Germans, but they were ultimately murdered like everybody else. In the view of the ideal world, there was simply no place for the Jews, or the Sinti and Roma, who were also part of the same genocidal process. So those are some of the reasons that make comparisons between the Shoah and other genocides difficult. But the reasons are not only historical, they are also, on the one hand, political, on the other, metaphysical. Politically, the story of the post-war perception of the Shoah is very different from the story of all other genocides. The Jews have the privileged position of having the world remember our suffering the way that we remember it. As victims of other genocides know, this is by far not an obvious proposition. In some genocides, like the Armenian genocide in Turkey, the perpetrator nation refuses to recognize that there was a genocide at all, let alone endorse the history of that genocide through the eyes of its victims. In the case of the Ukrainian Holodomor, there are serious legal issues regarding whether it can even be classified as a genocide. Cambodia usually gets forgotten, and in fact would not even probably be considered a genocide in legal terms, if not for the fact that the Khmer Rouge, on top of exterminating several million Cambodians, also exterminated Cambodian Muslims for being Muslim. As we all know, the fact that the enumerative list in the Genocide Convention does not list social groups as groups whose extermination qualify for the legal designation of genocide, makes the legal attribution of the category genocide to the Ukrainian Holodomor or to the Cambodian genocide very difficult. In the case of Rwanda, probably if you would do a street poll asking people, so who killed whom in Rwanda? Was it Tutsi killing Hutus or Hutus killing Tutsis? The most probable answer would be, I don't know and I don't care. Of this background, the fact that the Jewish narrative of the Shoah has become the universal narrative is extraordinary. And it gives the Shoah a prominence that other genocides do not have. The reason why this happened, obviously, is that, first of all, the Shoah has those characteristics that set it apart from other genocides, but also because it happened in Europe and therefore was immediately more salient than any other act of genocide, helped to create this situation. And ultimately, since the Shoah was a culmination of a long history of hatred towards Jews and caused a great deal of soul searching among Christian Europeans, this also facilitated the universal adoption of the history of the Shoah as the victims experienced it. However, this is not only a methodological issue, it's also a political issue in the sense that this universal remembrance of our suffering gives us, at least rhetorically, the possibility to identify, brand, and condemn any kind of distortion, negationism, rejection of facts that other sufferers cannot do, since their stories are not universally accepted. And as Jews consider themselves, to a degree legitimately, as potential victims still, it is obvious that we do not want to lose this political singularity, this capacity of identifying hatred directed at us and branding it legitimately with the memory of the Shoah. It is very visible in what I consider the very shameful treatment the Israeli government gives to the Armenian genocide, where it refuses to recognize the genocide as a genocide, not only because of practical political considerations of relations with Turkey, but also because the Israelis believe, and probably rightly, that recognizing another genocide as something similar to the Shoah would reduce the political importance of denunciations of anti-Semitism, as if this were a zero-sum game. But ultimately, the reason why many people refuse to consider the Shoah another genocide is metaphysical. The concentration of evil shown by the perpetrators in the Shoah, their single-mindedness of purpose, the fact that they continued in it even to their own detriment. The classical proof being the fact that in 1944, when the German army desperately needed rolling stock to transfer its troops to fronts of a war it was about to lose, still priority was given to use the railroads to transport Hungarian Jews to the death camp of Auschwitz, where almost 500,000 were exterminated, clearly at the detriment of the strategic needs of the German army. So here we have a situation in which the perpetrators are willing to sacrifice their own fundamental interests in order to be able to continue the genocide. This is a concentration of evil which even to students of other genocides remains shocking and incomprehensible, which is why some early thinkers about the Shoah said that the Shoah is unique, is incomparable, in fact, should not be compared, because any comparison, they say, would trivialize the Shoah, make it just another genocide, while it is so much more. Arthur Cohen, once very influential, today largely forgotten Jewish religious thinker, used the term tremendum, which comes from the Latin and expresses the kind of trembling fear that we feel when we stand in awe of something. The Shoah, he said, is an incomprehensible tremendum. Probably the writer who did the most to promote this perception of the Shoah was Elie Wiesel, a survivor of the Shoah himself, whose book Night, about his experience in the death camp of Auschwitz, became probably the most widely read book about Auschwitz, comparable in terms of Shoah literature only to the Journal of Anne Frank. And Wiesel very clearly said, the Shoah cannot be compared, it cannot be comprehended, it has to be left in a universe of its own. And I feel very strong sympathy and understanding for this perspective. However, if I reject it, it is because of its unavoidable consequences. If we decide that the Shoah is unique and therefore incomparable, and therefore impossible to understand, we relegate to this separate universe not only the perpetrators with their incomprehensible evil, but also the victims. And I think that this is not something that is morally acceptable. And if we decide that we share the same moral universe with the victims, then that moral universe needs to extend to the barbed wires of Auschwitz and Treblinka, because that is where they went. And therefore, we need to assume the responsibility, the tremendous responsibility, for including that experience in our own moral universe. Yehuda Bauer, an Israeli historian who is probably the most important historian of the Shoah to date, writes that he initially also believed the Shoah to be unique for the reasons that I just mentioned. And eventually, he changed his opinion, and he now no longer considers the Shoah unique, but unprecedented. Nothing like the Shoah happened before the Shoah. But once the Shoah happened, this is empirical proof it can happen again. Therefore, the Shoah is not unique. It is, quote unquote, only unprecedented. What does this mean for the study of genocide? Well, first of all, as I had said earlier, there is no understanding without comparison. And therefore, if we want to try to understand genocide, we need to compare. But there is an inherent danger to any comparison, Comparison reduces. We look at the phenomenon, we eliminate traits that we consider secondary, we leave the traits that are, in our eyes, the most important, and then we try to look for those traits in another similar phenomenon in order to establish the degree of similarity. While this process is conceptually unavoidable, this literally is what comparison means. It is psychologically and morally damaging. It reduces this fundamental traumatic experience to a number of categories that I think are useful and central. Such a procedure unavoidably must seem demeaning to those who were affected by the genocide. To use not a very good metaphor, think about the biggest love in your life, and then think of a researcher who would reduce that love to a number of repetitive elements that he encounters in other loves. Even if methodologically sound, such a procedure would unavoidably feel demeaning, banalizing, reducing, and hurtful. Which is why I think it is so important to remember at the same time the separate identity of each genocide. And here I believe names are very important. First of all, the idea that each genocide has its own name brings home the understanding that they are not just iterations of the same phenomenon, but phenomenologically separate and autonomous events. Which is why the Shoah is the Shoah, the Porajmos is the Porajmos, the Medzjägern is the Medzjägern, and so on and so forth. In the case of genocides that do not have a proper name, I strongly support attempts to give them a universally recognized proper name. But that proper name needs to be proper, which is why I refuse to use the very often used term Holocaust. It comes from the Greek holokauston, and it means the religious sacrifice of one of 10. You would bring 10 sheep to the temple and one would be slaughtered to please the gods. Of course, nobody thinks of the etymology of the term when using it. But once you think of it, I believe you cannot fail to recognize just how deeply offensive the implications of the term are. My family was not offered in a religious sacrifice. They were murdered by murderers. And using a term with religious connotations to describe that murder introduces a lie in the very understanding of what happened. The Hebrew word Shoah means destruction. And this is what happened. The destruction of an entire people. Which is why I use the term Shoah and not Holocaust, even if I recognize that the battle is lost. Everybody says Holocaust. So what can we draw as a practical lesson from if we agree that comparing is necessary? First of all, in order to compare, we need to define. We need to have a shared definition of what constitutes genocide in order to compare phenomenologically separate events and include them in the one genocide class. Now, Genocide, obviously, is a social construct. It did not conceptually exist until Lemkin thought it up in the early 30s, only to see to his horror his abstract concept being implemented 10 years on. But therefore, the definition matters. Lemkin's original definition of genocide in the early debates about the UN Genocide Convention included social and political groups alongside racial, national, ethnic, and religious as those whose attempt to exterminate wholly or in part constitutes genocide. Now, this obviously was vetoed by the Soviet Union, who then would be, if the definition would have been accepted, would have been guilty of genocide by that definition in its treatment of the Holodomor. And this leaves social and political groups out, which creates the fundamental problems of including as genocide the Cambodian genocide or the Holodomor. This is a question of wording. However, the legal wording is of particular importance because it is an attempt to set up universal standards. In academic debate, we have over 50 definitions of genocide, and some of them, in fact, much better conceptually and methodologically than the UN definition. But the UN definition has one major thing going for it, and that is the force of international law. And even though it is a bad definition, the flawed one, I believe we need to stick to it, and we should not try to amend it and improve it. When it was passed in 1949, the experience of the Shoah was still raw. And states endorsing this definition, the definition was passed unanimously, were thinking of the German Third Reich as the object of this entire new legal setup. States, with the exception of the Soviet Union, did not think that they themselves could become subjects of an inquiry under this definition. Today, states are much wiser. And if, heaven forbid, somebody would have the brilliant idea in the UN of introducing amendments to the definition in order to improve it, be assured that all the amendments introduced would have just one purpose: to make sure that my country, whatever that country is, cannot be accused of genocide under any circumstances. Any attempt to improve the UN definition would only serve to politically eviscerate it. So we're stuck with this legal definition the way it is. But a fundamental conceptual problem, which we do need to address when considering genocide, is to understand, as Lemkin did, that genocide is not just one particularly big massacre. It is not about the number of victims, but about the intention of the perpetrators. It is about their conceptually fully aware attempt to create a world in which the victim group is no more, in the belief that such a world will be better for all of humanity, or for the ethnic or religious or social or political group of the perpetrators. This is secondary. In this sense, as opposed to mass murder, which is, well, mass murder committed by murderers who enjoy the act of murder, genocide is an act committed by moral individuals who want to improve the world by eliminating a group which is detrimental to that improvement. Be they Cambodian peasants, be they Jews or Sinti and Roma, be they Ukrainian Kulaks, be they Herero and Nama in Namibia, though the group to be eliminated is detrimental to a better future for everybody else, or at least a group of the everybody else. And this, in fact, I believe, constitutes the differentia specifica, the one aspect that all genocides have in common, and mass murders do not. The motivation of the mass murderer is fundamentally different. Mass murderers commit their crimes because they enjoy it. Many of us humans apparently enjoy inflicting pain and suffering and ultimately death on other human beings. But as we all know, there can be too much of a good thing. All descriptions of mass murder from ancient times to modern clearly show that this orgy of killing lasts a few days. And eventually, once the murderers are satiated with blood, they stop. And whoever survives that, let them live, who cares? This is explicitly what genocide is not. In genocide, the perpetrators draw no pleasure, at least declare to draw no pleasure from their actions. They act because, as moral individuals, they cannot stand aside when others are improving the world. This is Himmler's speech to the SS in Posen in 1943. This is what génocidaires, perpetrators of genocide, in jail in Kigali, Rwanda, told me about their motivations. This is what perpetrators of the act of genocide in Srebrenica, Bosnia, said about their actions. In fact, one of them, General Krstić, gave a very useful additional operative element to a useful definition of genocide. He rejected the accusations against him during a court session of the tribunal in The Hague, but then said, okay, let's accept for the sake of discussion that what the prosecution alleges actually happened, that we murdered those Muslim men and boys in Srebrenica. The prosecutors say that there were 8,400 victims. 8,400. Is that a genocide? To which the presiding judge answered, and just how many would have satisfied you, General? And General Krstić gave up that particular defense line. Yes, 8,400 can be a genocide if those victims were murdered in order to create a world without them. And the slaughter of dozens of thousands, as we had seen, I don't know, in the Mongol invasions or in the taking of Constantinople, does not constitute genocide if the object was the enjoyment of the perpetrators. Now, obviously, it's not always easy to keep such a clinical distinction between the two. And certainly mass murderers enjoy themselves in a genocide just as they enjoy themselves in murder. But this, I think, is a fundamental conceptual element which is missing from Lemkin's definition, and which helps us understand why, regardless of all the differences, the Shoah, the Paraimos, the Cambodian genocide, the Armenian genocide, Namibia, Srebrenica belong in the same class. These crimes were committed for the betterment of humanity or a group of humanity, not for the enjoyment of their perpetrators. This is what makes genocide comparable. And this, in fact, is the tremendum that Arthur Cohen mentioned. Because I believe that if we honestly look into the mirror, we can, to an extent, understand those who draw pleasure from inflicting suffering to others. All of us had in our lives experiences when we inflicted pain, or at least wished we had inflicted pain. This is a universal human trait. The vision of exterminating people for the improvement of humanity, I do find incomprehensible, in the sense that Elie Wiesel used the word when he said that the Shoah is incomprehensible. But this incomprehensible element I discover in all genocides that I study, and I find it absent from mass murder. On the basis of that, we can agree, I believe, that yes, ultimately, the Shoah is incomprehensible. And this is what makes it a genocide alongside other genocides. It is the motivation of the perpetrators. It is not the technical aspects of the execution of their crime. And to sum it up, I think that this leaves us as a very important conclusion. We, in the study of particularly heinous crimes, we try to convince ourselves that the defining element of those crimes is, this is not us. That the motivations and the actions of the perpetrators are so heinous, so obscene, that they cannot really be part of the same species. But in the motivation of the perpetrators of genocide, in the roots of that motivation, we recognize something which normally we consider a positive accomplishment of humanity, which is the belief that we are responsible for making a better future. This is not a universal human belief. It has its place in human intellectual history. In Europe, it comes with the Enlightenment and with the vision of an enlightened state, which is responsible for the betterment of its citizens. Genocide is not a throwback to the barbarian era. It is not a mindless orgy of murder. It is the Enlightenment project gone wrong. And if so, we need to recognize that the institutions necessary for genocide are already incipient in the normal everyday institutions of the Enlightenment state. They need to be perverted for a genocide to take place. They do not need to be invented. They're already there. This, together with the incomprehensibility of the emotional aspect of the perpetrator's motivation, constitutes the binding framework of genocide. And yes, it is more clearly visible in the Shoah than in other genocides. But it does not set the Shoah aside. To the contrary, it is the ultimate proof that the Shoah belongs in the broader category of genocide. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Konstanty, for these very inspiring, thought-provoking words. I think we could have a very long discussion going in different directions, and I'm looking forward to it. I think, you know, one of the things you alluded to is is strongly related to the message of our organization's name, Never Again. And of course, when we talk about the Holocaust or the Shoah or genocide and combating genocide distortion, we don't just deal with it for the sake of commemoration. We deal with it for the sake of the contemporary human rights challenges. And in this context, I could immediately mention the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border, where people have been dying in the last days and hours, but also other borders, such as the border area between Myanmar and Bangladesh, where there are hundreds of thousands of refugees in dramatic circumstances. And with us, we have Nikki Diamond, who is a specialist on the contemporary issue of Rohingya genocide. And before we give the floor to Nikki, I just wanted to mention what Konstanty said in the very beginning. We are a truly international and intercontinental group. Let me try and list at least some of the countries which are represented here in no particular order. I can see Poland, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, China, Germany, India, Russia, Bangladesh, Japan. If I omitted any country, please feel free to correct me and write it in the chat. If you have some comments or questions, please write them in the chat too, or raise your hand, and we will provide some time and space for the discussion. But now, Nikki, please go ahead.
Thanks. First, I'd like to thank Professor Konstanty for your excellent presentation. It's really, I have learned a lot. And thanks Natalia and Professor Raphael for inviting me as a discussant here. This great discussion on the Holocaust and other genocide is comparison possible. Thanks everyone, and I'm very happy to try this discussion. Today, I will be speaking from my experience in Myanmar. Whenever we talk about genocide worldwide in our human history, I realize that there's one commonality. Our humanity failed to prevent genocide in the past and present, which is the unforgettable reality in our human history. That question here is why we human were unable to prevent genocide. So after Second World War, the human rights movement gained momentum as ever. So as we can see today, the internationalization of human rights norms and value, the international human rights law and mechanism at the United Nations, significant progress if we compare them to the past. And we cannot deny this kind of development, but we still fail to prevent genocide. So I think the reality is bitter. The more we learn, the more painful it is. For throughout our history, our effort has no longer been enough to prevent genocide. So whatever genocide happened in the past, some people may see it as a burden of history. So well, it is history what we all should learn and treat like a commitment, but not a disaster. So I see no obligation from the powerful states, but the international community ignorant in the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. In the case of Rohingya, the international community ignored all early warning signs of genocide against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, which led to the failure of genocide prevention. So on this point, I like to argue that the failure to prevent genocide centers on ignorance and lack of political commitment. So we talk about history all the time, the burden of history. So people never learn and commit to preventing genocide. So when the powerful nation failed to take action against the early warning signs of genocide, it is an absolute disaster. So we all witnessing on the state of war politics today. And also we are learning genocide in our history that matter to foresee preventable genocide in the future. So all our series of history lecture will guide us in our moral compass to prevent genocide. When the international decision-making delay responding to the early warning of genocide, it became history and a burden that we never wanted to pass to our next generation. The current day failure became a burden of history for our future generation as well. It is not their fault, but our insufficiency will cost them. They will have to pay for it. If the past is not sturdy, thoroughly, and honestly, it will remain a burden for the future. So we must definitely be aware of it. In Myanmar, democracy and human rights icon Aung San Suu Kyi and her supporters failed to address the Rohingya genocide. They are totally ignorant and whitewashing for the military perpetrator at the ICJ had burdened the current political fight between National Unity Government and the junta, their military-led State Administration Council. Well, the NUG could not easily convince the international ally for the recognition of being a legitimate government of Myanmar. It is not their fault, but they have to carry the burden of previous ignorance and not protecting the most vulnerable Rohingya in Northern Rakhine State when the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi were in power. However, the NUG quickly learned to formulate its Rohingya policy to handle the Rohingya crisis internationally and domestically. So I salute their tireless efforts to manage Aung San Suu Kyi's round political judgment on the Rohingya genocide resulted in losing her pride. The new spring revolution in Myanmar shows that Aung San Suu Kyi's era ended. Many young people are taking responsibility to resist the military coup. No international and domestic campaign called for her release. Without her leadership in NUG and the time for the revolution in Myanmar, people are fighting for the new Federal Democratic Republic of Myanmar. So comparing temporary genocide with other genocide in our history should pay attention to anticipating genocidal threats against vulnerable ethnic and religious groups. Without early warning of genocidal threats, the prevention wouldn't take place. Before the mass killing, there has always been institutionalized discrimination. The government discriminatory law, policy, and practices against religious or ethnic minority on the ground. Identifying, detecting early warning signs of genocide will help the prevention of future genocide. Without the solid political commitment and preventive measures from the international community and scholarship of comparative genocide in the past and present, preventing genocide is what we wish to see. I think we still have hope for it. I also think the principle never again should be international norm and obligation to prevent future genocide around the world. Yeah, that's thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I think what you said is very significant and very relevant. Also, bridging the history of the Shoah in Europe and Southeast Asia and the contemporary situation in Myanmar without trivializing it. So thank you very much. Now I would like to open the floor for other comments or questions. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. Well, we have a really diverse group of participants, not just in terms of countries, but also in terms of competences. For example, we have friends who work at the Cambodian Genocide Museum in Phnom Penh, which I think well, was referred to several times by Konstanty. We have human rights activists. We have people who work in other museums and genocide commemoration centers across the world. So I think we have a diversity of perspectives, so we can share them. I would encourage any comments. I cannot see a comment just yet. Yes, okay, Helen Jarvis from Phnom Penh. Very nice to have you with us. Please take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rafael, Natalia, and of course to our speaker, Konstanty, who I do not have the pleasure of knowing or having met before. I very much would like to meet him again and to continue this discussion, because I find his presentation this evening is really extremely significant, I think. His closing words, that the genocide is an enlightenment project gone wrong, really struck home to me. And in our in the Cambodian context, this is, I think, what has challenged us and been so difficult for us to grasp, because yes, at what point does something that could be a progressive thought, a progressive act, a progressive movement, turn into its exact opposite? And I think that this concept is something I haven't really come across before in such a clear presentation. So I'm very grateful for this, and I think maybe we should explore this a little further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Konstanty, would you like to respond?
Neither did I have the pleasure of meeting you, Helen, earlier, but I would very much welcome the opportunity and the possibility of learning more about the Cambodian genocide, which you're completely right, is an excellent, almost laboratory case of an example of a project to improve society, which is how it was solved for the Cambodian people, initially with quite a lot of success, turning, as you said, into the exact opposite. And my concern here is that one of the mistakes that we make, both conceptually and politically, is our reliance on institutions, be they big political movements, be they states. Nikki, you're absolutely right. States should act against genocide. In fact, states have a clear legal obligation to under the convention, except that they don't. And the reason is always the same. They consider it more expedient not to act than to take action. The American journalist David Reeve, whom I met when we were both in Bosnia during the war, in his book Slaughterhouse, about the Bosnian experience, has this extraordinary one-liner. He says, after Srebrenica, after Sarajevo, we know what never again means. It means that never again shall Germans kill Jews in World War II. That's all that it means. We refuse to draw the conclusions. We act as if genocide was, as the French say, an accident de parcours, just a bump on the road, right? What if the problem is the road itself? What if the idea of improving humanity should be treated with caution? We assume that if people want to improve humanity, it's all for the greater common good, right? Well, possibly wrong. And one example that comes to mind is a Rwandan school teacher. The example comes from the book by Roméo Dallaire, the UN Blue Helmet commander in Rwanda during the genocide. His account of the events, Shake Hands with the Devil, is one of the most important sources for understanding that genocide. And Dallaire writes that in February '94, they started getting reports that Rwandan school teachers were sent a circular from the Ministry of Education ordering them to produce lists of Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa students in their school classes. And Dallaire writes, well, it struck us slightly bizarre, but there was so much going on, we didn't pay attention. The genocide happened 2 months later. Now, I try to put myself in the shoes of this Rwandan school teacher who gets the circular. Well, what is it they want from me? It's ridiculous. Why should I make lists of the ethnic appartenance, socio-ethnic in this case, of my students? But then he tells himself, okay, is that the first stupid circular I get from the Ministry of Education? And maybe actually there's even a legitimate reason for that. Maybe they want to compare educational outcomes and see if a group isn't underprivileged and then take corrective measures. They have a right to ask. So I write down those lists and send them to the ministry. These were kill lists. Because in Rwanda, you couldn't really tell most of the time Tutsi, Hutu, and Twa apart by their physical appearance. I mean, there were some people who looked very Tutsi and some people who looked very Hutu. Most everybody on the street looked Rwandan. You had to check their ID papers where the belonging to the particular group was written in to know if they're Tutsi or Hutu. But you got your national ID only at age 18. So for the younger, for the kids in that teacher's class, there was no objective way of knowing if these people are to be killed or not. That's why the ministry needed those lists. So, as we know, the state institutions functioned fantastically in Rwanda. They made the genocide possible. The international community, as it usually does, stayed passive until it was over. The one thing that might have been an obstacle to the project, if teachers would say, hell no, I'm not writing any list until the ministry convinces me that there is a legitimate reason, and they really have to convince me. The problem, of course, is we all know this kind of people. They're impossible to work with, right? They exist in any organization, any institution, the people who always object, always criticize, mistrust, whatever, they usually get expelled because it's impossible to work with them. And it really is. But then, when push comes to shove, these people who refuse to accept that they, in the institutional structure that we're all part of, that they, the higher ups, have a right to ask, and my job is to write down the list and not rock the boat. These people save what's left of humanity. And they're still impossible to work with in normal times. what sets them apart from others is not ideological or political or religious belief. I have the privilege of knowing many Polish righteous Gentiles, the non-Jewish Poles who risked their lives to save Jews during World War II. And they absolutely didn't have one common trait, okay? They could be rabid communists or bigoted Catholics. They could be princes of the blood or common thieves. The one thing that they had in common was they couldn't leave well enough alone. They couldn't convince themselves that it's not their business. Even if they tried. One of the gentlemen, after we had a few vodkas, told me, look, mister, please don't be offended. I need to tell you, I don't even like Jews, okay? I just couldn't let this happen. I tried to convince myself that it's none of my business, and I couldn't. Now, this is not something that we can expect from states or institutions or organizations. This, in fact, is a character trait, which is a horrible nuisance in peacetime. We don't want to foster this character trait. But if genocide is the Enlightenment project gone wrong, then those people are the only force that will hinder it. So we really have to make a choice about the kind of attitudes we want to foster. The way we want to raise our children. Do we want to raise our children to be compatible and cooperating elements of a greater whole? Or do we want to raise them to be cussed and mistrustful and responsible for the entire planet? Because the two really are incompatible. It's one or the other. And I don't have a good answer because honestly, I don't like those people, right? They're really a pain in the ass and impossible to work with. They just happen to save the world when nobody else does.
Thank you very much, Konstanty. We have two very interesting questions in the chat, one from Thailand, one from Bangladesh, I believe. Verita Sriratana is our friend, the professor at the Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok. Verita, if you are still with us, would you like to make a comment? I think Verita said she had to skip from one meeting to another, so maybe she is not with us just now, but she put her question in the chat. And as I understand, the main part of the question is, would you agree that the Holocaust can be viewed in comparison with genocides or democides in Southeast Asia, as long as we are conscious that we refer to the term, whether Shoah or the Holocaust, as part of strategic essentialism, as Spivak once advised?
I'm not sure if I know what strategic essentialism is, but as I said earlier, I see enough common elements between the genocide in Cambodia and the Shoah to classify them within a broader class of phenomena without ignoring or banalizing their differences. What we do have in common is this idea of improving the world, well, for the Khmer Rouge or for the Nazis, by eliminating groups that refuse to conform to this new and better vision of the world. We have an utter lack of compassion. And we have a project that largely was brought to fruition. Europe today is practically Judenrein, free of the Jews, as the Nazis had claimed their objective. Cambodia remains in a traumatic post-genocide state with the impact of genocide making a self-organizing society which itself chooses the future it wants to implement instead of having it imposed on it, impossible, right? Now, there are also very important differences. The Cambodian genocide, together with the Rwandan genocide, was as non-technological as possible. The hoe in Cambodia, the machete in Rwanda, as opposed to the highly technological structures, such as the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka, purpose-built and having only that goal. But this difference, which is no small difference, really it just expresses the level of technological development of the countries. Germany was already then highly technological and specialized, and it did its killing in a highly technological and specialized way. Cambodia and Rwanda were and remain essentially rural societies, and they did their killing the way you do your work in the countryside. Highly extensive, that is, involving a lot of people, because you don't have the technology to replace the human labor. And therefore relying on mass mobilization rather than on specialization. But these are characteristics not only of the genocides, but of the dominant modes of production in the countries we compare. So not even knowing if I'm really addressing the question raised, and I'm not familiar with Spivak's term, I see fundamental similarities, and I believe the differences are due to the general nature of the countries we're discussing, rather than to the specificity of their genocide.
Thank you very much, Konstanty. As I read Verita's comment, she also mentioned by strategic essentialization, I mean giving essence respectfully to the Shoah and its historical specificity for strategic reasons, for discussions like today and for what Never Again is aiming to achieve, which I think is related to what you just alluded to. Mm-hmm. We have two more questions now. One is from Faisal from the Liberation War Museum in Dhaka. Faisal, would you like to pose your question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks to Konstanty for the beautiful lecture, and amazing lecture. It was quite informative for me. But after hearing your lecture, I had a question that peeped into my mind. I'd like to, to share the question with you and hear your views. So my question is that, do you also regard the Shoah as an unique example of genocide due to its transnational nature?
This, in fact, is one of the traits that are not reproduced across other genocides. The other trait is the impossibility to escape. But Shoah was transnational, but that was because it was part of a larger transnational effort by the Third Reich, namely an attempt to control the world. It is true that in no other genocide did we have the perpetrators prepare for future genocides in future countries to be conquered. During the Wannsee conference in Berlin, where the details of the Shoah were planned, a list of countries with the numbers of Jews to be murdered was established. And that included Ireland, for example, the Republic of Ireland, that Germany not only did not occupy, but was not even at war with, Ireland remaining neutral in World War II. Yet, the complete German project necessitated also the extermination of the Jews of Ireland. Eventually, when the moment comes, but unavoidably, just like every Jew in Poland was to be exterminated. Now, this does not happen in the other genocides that we study. But then again, in no other genocide that the perpetrators also attempt to achieve world domination. So this is a characteristic of the broader project rather than of the genocide itself. What does set the Shoah apart, and I'm still unsure how important this difference is, as I said earlier, that there was really no possibility for a Jew to evade being murdered. In all other genocides, there were ways for victims, or some of the victims, to betray their own and join the perpetrators and thus save their lives. In the Shoah, you could betray your own, become a ghetto policeman, for example, but this only extended your life slightly until you were no longer useful to the Germans, at which you were murdered, like everybody else. There was no escape strategy. And this, in fact, sets the Shoah apart. But as I said earlier, I'm not entirely sure just how important this factor is. And I still believe that the other similarities justify considering the Shoah as a genocide among other genocides.
Thank you very much. As far as I can see, we have two more comments in the chat. One is from the Netherlands and mentions the Dutch constitution that starts with the issue of discrimination in Article 1, but still the comment mentions gender-based discrimination, which is happening in many different countries, if not all. So I understand that is a comment. And then there's a longer comment from India, which is more specifically related to the human rights situation in India, from a venerable monk. I don't know, Konstanty, if you can read it. Can you see it?
Yeah, I'm just.
Would you like to comment on it?
Right. Okay. Referring to the Indian question, I respectfully have to not reply. I'm really not familiar enough with the details of the situation you describe. And I think that one of the problems with comparative studies in general, and comparative genocide especially, is people speaking out without sufficient knowledge. I believe that detailed knowledge of each individual case is fundamental before I start forming my opinion about anything at all. And it would be simply disrespectful for me to speak out on the case you're raising without having the knowledge necessary. So I have to apologize, but I will not answer this question. The question for the Netherlands about sex or gender being stated in the passport, I actually find very interesting. because it seems to me to be a variant of the Rwandan school teacher question. In fact, what business at all has the state in asking me my gender, let alone establishing a list which might constitute only 2 elements from which I can choose? And what this element does, it strengthens the general belief that my identity is not my business alone, nor am I qualified myself to choose my identity. That ultimately the state gets to decide what the elements are and what can I choose from. Now, this is important because one of the elements that makes genocide possible is classification. And the more elements of knowledge about ourselves we give the state, the easier the state's job is if the state would revert to genocide. Now, obviously, in almost all cases, the state doesn't. But the very possibility that it might should, as a bare minimum, make us suspicious, the way the Rwandan school teacher should be suspicious. Now, there is a legitimate question, therefore. Why does the state need to know my gender? And say 50 years ago, one element of the answer would have been, in order to be able to establish my personal identity, and for that, they need as many elements as possible. Sadly, today, my personal identity can be established beyond any doubt on the basis of biometric characteristics. The state doesn't need to ask me my gender or my birthday or the names of my parents. It simply does because this is what it always did, and we let it. I think that one of the lessons of genocide is not really trusting the state to be eternally benevolent. And therefore, if we share any personal information with the state, there needs to be a good reason. I certainly agree that the state has a right to know whether I have been vaccinated against COVID, because I see the common good argument in that. I see absolutely no common good argument in the state asking me my gender.
And thank you very much. If I can make a short comment myself in this context, I found that some of the societies in Asia, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, are actually more tolerant of gender diversity as well as issues of sexual orientation than some of the societies in Europe, which may or may not be surprising, but I think that's one of the things about Southeast Asia that I remembered. So I think no, we have a lot to learn from each other in many different ways. Now I cannot see any more comments or questions just now, but there is still a chance to ask them. If not, I will try to ask my own question. I've been thinking about it for some minutes already. I think I understand the phrase enlightenment gone wrong. I think it's a thought-provoking phrase, and of course Zygmunt Bauman and others argued in similar terms. But don't you think it's also risky if we nail the issue of genocide on the very idea of the Enlightenment? I think we risk supporting some reactionary discourses that are opposed to the Enlightenment as such, not so much opposed to discrimination or even to genocide. So it's a fine distinction, which I find tricky.
I agree. But then again, nothing really is safe. It is obvious that showing the Enlightenment roots of genocide encourages the quite strong anti-Enlightenment intellectual milieus who would like to bring us back to the times when the state did not have an obligation to the greater common good of its citizens. However, being cautious is not a reason to be blind. The anti-Enlightenment attitude has its own fundamental problems. It believes that human nature, the way they define it, is enough, and therefore they have the right to act against what they consider unnatural in humans, like there being more than two genders, for example. It is not that the Enlightenment is wrong. Overall, the Enlightenment state has been a huge blessing for humanity. From universal vaccination through universal education to universal human rights, all these are Enlightenment projects gone right for a change. But it is not either or, it's and. We can, indeed, we should appreciate all the good that the Enlightenment project has done to humanity without closing our eyes that it is within the Enlightenment project that humanity's most murderous wars were fought. World War I and World War II. If you permit an aside, in a very famous anecdote, in 1947, Alan Foster Dulles was receiving some journalists in the State Department when he got a cable about yet another bloody massacre in then still British Palestine, be it Jews against Arabs, be it Arabs against Jews. That's irrelevant for the story. And he looked at it sadly and said, well, can the Jews and the Arabs solve their differences like good Christians? Apart from the fact that it's slightly implausible to expect Jews and Arabs to become good Christians, given the fact that barely 2 years earlier, good Christians stopped solving their differences in Europe, we should be thankful that Jews and Arabs were not good Christians, right? So every general project of civilization brings with it its own evils and its own dangers. And they should be part of our informed choice on whether we want to support that project, resist it, or modify it. But I agree with you. I mean, we all live in an Enlightenment world, and thank God for that, right? But that should not make us blind to the possible price we can pay.
Thank you very much, Konstanty. We have one more very interesting comment or a question in the chat from Katayani Singh, which I am going to read out. Is identity a problem or the humanization of a particular section of society the problem?
Again, it's not either or. In order to dehumanize, you have to identify, right? You have to produce a blueprint of elements that make the group undesirable. In order to do that, you have to adopt a normative identity and then indicate what makes the identity of that group non-normative. The interesting element here is that it doesn't really matter if the identity you ascribe to the group is their own. The opinion of the future victims doesn't count. It's the opinion of the future perpetrators that does. And this is why we need to be very mistrustful of identity-producing institutions in liberal societies. These are the schools and the media, right? It is impossible, I believe, to have a genocide without obtaining control over the schools and the media first. German youth were trained in a certain way, brought up in a certain way, read media that extolled certain values and condemned others. And very similar was the process in Rwanda, even though it was a society that was much less literate. So identity production is also a fundamental element of genocide.
Thank you very much. Well, we have exhausted our time today. We have not exhausted the subject, and I would like to invite everybody to the next discussions. But first of all, big thanks to Konstanty, big thanks to Nikki, and to everybody who participated in the discussion and in today's meeting. The next discussion, well, we are going to inform you about the specific date very shortly, but I think I can already advertise it, and I can mention that our guest will be Sarah Lambert, who is a digital curator at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she's the creator of the digital exhibition under the title Burma: The Path to Genocide. So it should be also interesting and strongly related to the important issues we talked about today. One very last thing is something that we tried to do several times previously as well. Before we say goodbye, can I encourage everybody to turn on their cameras, and in that way we could have a joint photo online. So I would like to ask everybody who is okay with it to turn on their camera. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much again, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Good night to all.
Bye.